Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm so glad to have you here. My name is Dan. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Bespoke Education. Today, we're glad to be starting off our summer season of free webinars. We started this series last fall. It's amazing. It's been almost a year, but the intent remains the same. We're trying to get useful information out there for you all, trying to answer questions that are on everyone's mind. I'm so excited for today's webinar. We have everything you need to know about the ISEE and SSAT with an expert panel of our tutors with decades of experience teaching these tests. Before we do that, I'm going to do a quick introduction to Bespoke Education, just walk you through what we do. We're going to share our website. Bespoke Education has been in business for almost 20 years. We offer a full slate of educational services throughout any child's academic journey. We're based in New York City, but now we're realizing more and more what a national and even an international reach we have developed. So we want to share that with you. We offer classes. We offer summer boot camps. We offer intensives. We also offer seminars and classes in partnerships with schools and organizations all throughout the New York metro region. And if you like this presentation or you're interested in bringing something like this to one of your organizations or to your school, please reach out and let us know, and we'll work on setting that up. We do mock testing. This is a big piece of standardized test prep. We're going to touch on it a lot as we go on because that's what we're here to talk about today. But we do it in our offices and online, and we are an industry leader here. We have some other tutors and even some other tutoring companies that send their students to us for this service. So please check that out. Unlike many other tutoring companies, we also focus on a pro bono component with a department that we call Bespoke Education Access. We offer low and no cost classes at deserving schools and free one-on-one tutoring for students who need it. And we are working on really living our values of community and equity and access in education. All throughout the academic journey, in all the contexts, we offer academic coaching and support. We do mentorship, remediation, and enrichment for students of all ages, for questions on resumes, for questions on college applications, and those essays. It's really a whole suite of services, so please be in touch. The calls are free. The calls can be 20, 30 minutes. We are glad to share this information with you, so please reach out. We're sharing that contact information in the chat. And lastly, we come to today's topic, which is test preparation. We've been doing this since the very beginning of our work, doing the SAT, the ACT, a variety of high school tests like the APs and the Regents tests, also grad school tests like the GMAT, the GRE, the LSAT, the MCAT, but notably for today, the ISEE and the SSAT, the high school entrance tests, which can be a first encounter with standardized testing, a first encounter with preparation for so many students. And we've been doing this for years to helping them understand what it means to take these tests and how to meet these tests on their own terms. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Gary Jaffe, my colleague and our host for today. Gary Jaffe is a tutor here and a tutor manager, and he works with me on training tutors, notably in how to tutor the ISEE and the SSAT. Before I hand it over to him, a few logistical components. We have a small poll. I'm pulling that up. You can close it when you're done. We'd love to have your answers. That's going to impact a few things as we go on to hear what our audience is composed of today. If you have questions, please put them into the Q&A. That is the best place. The other audience members can see them and we can respond to them live as we go on. So please, if you've got questions, just throw them in there as they come up. We will incorporate them, and there'll also be a time at the end for more questions. So please, Gary Jaffe, welcome.
Thank you, Dan. It's my pleasure to be attending and moderating this ISEE SSAT webinar. As Dan mentioned, I train the tutors in how to teach the ISEE SSAT, and I have had the pleasure of working with many, many, many students on these tests. I've seen them go from ISEE SSAT to ACT, SAT, and even into college, which should tell you a little bit of how long I've been with the company. It is my greater pleasure to introduce our three expert panelists who have so much good information for you today. They are Leanne Arno, Kara Havig, and Matt Weir. So welcome all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'd love to hear a quick introduction to each of you with one thing you love about teaching the ISEE and the SSAT. Leanne, let's start with you.
Hi, I'm Leanne Arno. I've been tutoring this test for 7 years. I'm a general and special ed teacher, and my favorite thing about tutoring this test is watching kids learn. I find that actually test prep tutoring is not so different than academic support tutoring. And I think that the kids really develop their verbal and math skills through the test preparation process, and that transfers to school and beyond.
Absolutely. Thank you, Leanne. And Leanne has tremendous experience working with students with learning differences, which is going to come up as we discuss the way that accommodations work on the ISEE and the SSAT. Kara, over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Kara and I've been tutoring these tests for Bespoke for about 10 years. And I also help develop our mock test and our lesson content. And I've just always liked standardized tests. Even when I was a kid, I thought they were kind of fun, like logic puzzles or crossword puzzles. So I like to share that enthusiasm with kids so they know this doesn't have to be a terrible chore. It can be kind of fun. And for these tests specifically, I enjoy getting to work with younger students than the high school students or the college prep students that I have. I have 2 kids. I have 25 nieces and nephews, and I just really enjoy kids and kids stuff and finding out what they're into and chatting about it and bringing that same energy towards math and building confidence.
Absolutely. And Kara's totally right. That enthusiasm for these tests can be taught. It's not just something that you are lucky enough to be born with, although that does help. Matt, over to you.
Hi, I'm Matt Weir. I've been tutoring with Bespoke one-on-one or in classes for a long time. And I think my favorite part of working with students is demystifying these tests, showing them that these are not impersonal, end-all be-all general intelligence tests. They're not traps, but they are here to do something very specific and to test something very specific. And so we can work on them with that knowledge.
Absolutely. So much of what we do with these tests is psychological in addition to academic. Yes, there are things to learn from the book, but there's also just ways to approach it mentally. And that's what we will talk about today. All right, let's get this kicked off. Here is our funnel slideshow. Here are some key questions that we're going to answer over the course of this webinar. We're going to talk about when the students should take these tests. We will talk about what's on those tests when they take them. We'll go in fair depth about which test students should take if they're given the option. And that's an important if, which we'll get to in a moment. We will look into what kind of scores students need to gain admission to some of the more competitive high schools in the area and at boarding schools. We'll talk about a timeline. When should students start preparing for these tests? Spoilers, the answer is now. And we'll talk, especially with Leanne's expert guidance, about accommodations and how they work on the ISEE and the SSAT. But first, let's meet our contenders. The ISEE and the SSAT. The ISEE stands for the Independent School Entrance Exam. The SSAT stands for the Secondary School Admissions Test. Now, historically, the difference between these tests is that the ISEE was used by New York City area private schools and day schools around the nation, whereas historically the SSAT was used by boarding schools, ranging from your Andover and your, anything in the sort of Holden Caulfield, a separate piece or Catcher in the Rye experience would have required the SSAT. That chapter didn't make it into Catcher in the Rye. However, this is changing. Almost all the private schools in New York City now do accept both tests, and even those boarding schools are starting to accept the ISEE, which means that you have to check the schools that your student is applying to. Some of them may demand one or the other. To be aware of that is to help make sure that you are doing the right one. But if both are options, then a lot of the information we're talking about today will help you and your student decide which test is best for you. One little point, the tests are about 3 hours long, depending on the level, and there are no calculators allowed unless you have accommodations. So let's dig in. Kara, will you guide me through some of the fundamentals of the ISEE, please?
Sure thing. The ISEE, as Gary said, is probably the most common test taken for the New York City schools. And there are different levels of this test depending on what grade you're applying for. And you'll see here that, for example, the upper level is for grades applying, people applying to grades 9 through 12, but you're only compared to students applying to the same grade as you. So you don't need to worry about, oh my gosh, there are students older than me taking this test and harder content. You're only compared to students your own age. Now, the ISEE has 4 multiple choice sections, which correspond to your 4 scores, which we will talk about in a minute, and also an essay section that is not graded, but is sent to the school admissions committee so they can see a writing sample. The 4 multiple choice sections are always in the same order. First, there's the verbal section that includes synonyms and sentence completions or fill in the blanks. And then there's a quantitative reasoning section, which is the first math section. And this math section focuses less on making calculations and more on number sense and critical thinking and conceptual understanding. It has 2 mini sections. It has multiple choice word problems, and then it has something called quantitative comparisons. And in these, you have 2 columns, and a student has to say which column will be bigger, or if they're the same, or if it depends and you don't have enough information to say. Next, there is a reading section, which is pretty standard, about what you would expect for most standardized tests for reading. And then there's a mathematics achievement section, which is more straightforward than the quantitative reasoning section. It's more about, can you make these calculations? Can you identify the problem, find the steps, solve it without a calculator?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kara. And truly, the difference between that quantitative and math achievement section is significant. I like to think that quantitative is think about the math, whereas math achievement is do the math. You know how to do that one? Cool, do it. You know how to do that one? Cool, do it. Let's talk about this, this lack of a wrong answer penalty, because that's going to be a significant difference between the ISEE and the SSAT.
Yes, so the SSAT has a wrong answer penalty that we will talk about in a minute, but the ISEE does not, which means there's no difference between leaving an answer blank and getting an answer incorrect, which means you should always guess. If you have no idea, if you're out of time, pick a letter. There's a 1 out of 4 chance you're going to get it correct, so you should never leave anything blank.
Yeah, free points. Don't leave them blank. Great. Thank you so much, Kara. And Leanne, if you could tell me a little bit about when to take the ISEE, that would be very helpful.
Sure. So the ISEE has 3 testing seasons. These are August to November is the fall testing season. December to March is the winter testing season. And April through July is the spring and summer testing season. The spring and summer season is not as useful to most parents or students as the other seasons because of when applications are due, but it is an option. You should plan to take this test probably twice. We recommend that you start in October, November. And then you're going to take it a second time, probably in December, but really that second test should be as late as possible, especially for kids who are really just still needing the work. Some kids, I've had students who take it as late as January. Some schools will actually allow you to submit your test scores after you've sent in your application. So you can check and see if that's an option to push that second test as far back as possible. I also want to mention that there is now an at-home testing option, which is new. So you have the option for this test of doing it at a testing center or doing it at home. And if you choose to do it at home, you can go on the website and look at the requirements, but basically you have to have a laptop or computer that's compatible. You download their software, has to have a webcam, and then you can take the test. There's a proctor who is either, you can actually have a proctor from the school you're applying to. You get a code from the school, or you can have an ERB proctor. So that is an option, and we'll talk more about the different forms of the testing in a little bit.
Absolutely, thank you, Leanne. And you know, families ask, well, should I have this student take the test in September? You know, don't we want to spread them out a little bit more? And really, time is our friend here. And the problem with this August through, you know, early October timeframe is that the students just have less time available to learn the new content and to get acclimated to the test, which is also why this spring and summer slot is not useful as well. I've had one student take it in July and, you know, nail it from there, but he was the exception, not the rule. We had this question asked yesterday, and it's a good question, which is, if you do have a student take it in July, who are they compared against? Well, if you have a student who's taking the upper level, let's say they're a rising 8th grader, so they're applying for admission as a 9th grader, they will be compared against other 8th graders who are taking it in the upcoming fall. So you can see that a student would be disadvantaged if they take it in, for example, July, like, you know, in 2 days, you know, this month, 2021, versus someone taking it in December 2021. That's just 5 months, 5 months of practice. Hence, our really valuing this circled November, December moment for these tests. And as Leanne said, check with the schools, because some of them may allow January testing, and then it's between you and the student about whether or not, you know, taking a test after the Christmas, you know, holiday break is something that works. Sometimes the information drains out of the brain and then you really want to get it earlier. Sometimes it's fine. Thank you so much, Leanne. Let me clear my doodles here, and we will move on to Matt, who will tell us a little bit about what scores students should look for on these tests.
So first, the way that scoring works on the ISEE is that the ISEE takes your raw score, or your child's raw score, and converts it into a STAY9, which is just a word that means a grouping by percentage of other students who have comparable raw scores. So the STAY9s go from 1, which is the lowest, to 9, which is the highest, and they're distributed sort of by bell curve. So the middle one, as you can see, the 5 covers almost 20%, and the 1 and the 9 only cover 4%. The most selective schools are looking for 7s and above, and 7s, as you can see here, hit about the 80th percentile. That's kind of an important marker to think of. But also, while 2s and 3s can often be disqualifying or areas in which to do serious work, 4s and 5s, when paired with higher scores, I've seen a lot of students have success with that. And really importantly, when your student, especially if they have not seen this standardized test or many standardized tests before, if they're scoring 2s and 3s at the beginning, those can, and they do, leap to 7s and above. So it's really, this can look like sometimes more of a hurdle than it might actually be with consistent, productive work.
Absolutely. I would say it's more common than not that students will start in the 2s to 4s range. And then I don't want there to be a panic or a freak out moment at the beginning. I just want to be an acknowledgement that there's a lot of acclimation to be done over the course of the summer and the fall, and there's a lot of content to acquire. And we'll talk a lot about that later, but it is often the case that students can move from 2s and 4s over to the 7s and above that we need. It is also, yes, Matt.
Sorry, I believe you're about to say this, Gary, but I just wanted to say, like, talking about the psychology of all this too, not to panic as the 2s and 4s, if a student gets a 7, that is a really excellent score on this test. This is not like getting a 78% on a raw score on a test, like 9s are so hard to get. You have to be in the top 4 percentile, and no one can really expect that. So when students see like these 7s, that's a cause for celebration. Those are excellent scores.
Absolutely, and that is in fact what I was going to say. So good synergy there. I had a student get 7.878, and the parent was, does he need to take it again? Does he need to take it again? Are these good enough? And I had to assure her over and over again, this is great. You should go out for pizza. These are competitive, excellent scores, and the student has worked hard, and his hard work has been justly rewarded. Thank you, Matt. Let's take a look at that. So this is going to conclude our conversation about the ISEE in its fundamentals. So now we're going to shift our focus over to the SSAT in its fundamentals. Kara, back to you.
Okay. The overall format of the SSAT is very similar to the ISEE. There's still multiple test forms for different grade levels. There are still 4 multiple choice sections that are graded and 1 essay section that is not graded but is sent to the school. There's also 1 multiple choice section that is experimental. It's short, it's more for their research purposes. It doesn't affect your score, so it's not something to be concerned about. There are 2 math sections, but unlike the ISEE, they are not separate grades. It's more like 1 big math section split into 2 separate times. And so you only get 3 scores instead of 4. There's a verbal score, there's a reading score, and there is a math score. The verbal section is also has synonyms, but then it has analogies, which I think are kind of fun, but they can also be a more challenging aspect of the SSAT and involve some esoteric vocab. The reading section is quite similar to the ISEE, but the passages themselves are a bit more varied. On the ISEE, it's always going to be nonfiction, and on the SSAT, there is a poem, there might be fiction, there might be a newspaper article, and it tends to have more metaphorical language and interpretation. So the SSAT tends to be a better test for very strong readers. Another important thing to mention about the SSAT is there is a wrong answer penalty. So how this works is if you get a question correct, you get a point. And if you leave a question blank, it's just neutral, 0 points. And if you get a question incorrect, you lose a quarter of a point. And the reason this exists, it used to exist on a lot more tests, and now this seems to be the only test that still has a wrong answer penalty. But the idea is that if you completely randomly guessed on the entire test, the fractions of points that you miss would make up for the lucky guesses, and you just end up with a score of 0. But for our purposes, the reason this matters is that if you can eliminate even one answer as being incorrect, it's still in your best interest to guess. And this is something we work on with students to get in the habit of. If you have no clue between all 5, leave it blank. But if you can use your knowledge to eliminate 1 or 2 answer choices, still in your best interest to guess something.
Absolutely. And you know, Kara, usually of the 5 answer choices, you can get rid of 1. You can usually get rid of 2, maybe even 3. So essentially, unless the student is really running out of time or really has no idea, it may as well be in Mandarin or something like that, the students should guess if they can start the elimination process. And we do really practice that psychology, as you're saying, of how do you eliminate? How do you look for what's called a clunker? That's an answer that couldn't possibly be right. And even if you don't know the exact math or the exact words, how do you get closer to it? One thing that's worth talking about with regard to a slight difference between these tests is that the ISEE's language will use for placement in 9th grade or for placement in 10th grade. So an 8th grader who's looking for placement in ninth grade would look for that. So would a ninth grader who's looking for placement in ninth grade. The SSAT, however, use slightly different language, which you see here, which is for students in grades 8 through 11. When in doubt about which level your student should be taking, check with the school. If, for example, you have a student who is in ninth grade looking to repeat ninth grade, which is common, that is a common practice, just check with the school to make sure that you are having them take the correct test. Thank you, Kara, for the intro to the SSAT. Let's go to our points guy. Matt, nope, wait, what's just happened? Sorry, I skipped. I got too excited about the points and I skipped the calendar girl. Leanne, please take it away about when and how we can take the, I'm gonna be quiet now.
Okay, so the SSAT is offered a lot more frequently than the ISEE, but that does not mean that we encourage students to take it very frequently. The paper version of the test can be taken up to 5 times a year, plus there's one option for flex test per year. All levels can take a paper test, but the computer test, for example, is only for middle and upper levels, and so is the at-home test. There are 6 dates in 2021 to 2022. They don't offer a test in March, which is just fine by us. And the elementary level isn't offered till December, so that's important to know. We still recommend that you take this test about twice, unless if your child nails it on the first try, then great. But if you need a little bit extra, say your child takes it twice and still isn't quite where we'd like them to be or where they need to be, then you have the option of taking it an extra time. So that's a really nice thing about the SSAT. And I would still suggest do the first one in October or November, do the second one in December or January.
Sorry, I hit my mouse and it was very sensitive. Yeah, absolutely. And it is worth saying is just because they can take it multiple times does not mean that they should. At a certain point, it's just not healthy and it's not useful. The schools will look askance if they see, that the student has taken these tests 5 times. There are better things to be doing with your time. Now, there's an interesting question here that reflects both the ISEE and the SSAT, which I would love to hear the panel's point of view on. Do you have a preference between the computer test and the paper test? And if so, what's your preference?
I think, especially for students with disabilities who get accommodations, you really want to take into account your child and your child's individual needs. Some kids really hate writing by hand. I think these days a lot of kids aren't used to writing by hand. So for the writing section, that can be a challenge. Messy handwriting, if it's illegible, you might want to do the prometrics test where you can use a word processor for the writing section. Other kids are really visual and like to write out, write notes, write out their work on the math section, which we like to keep the work minimal. We'll get into that soon. And that is something they can't do although they can take notes on scrap paper if they're taking a computer test, it's not the same as writing on the actual test. So it really depends. I think that there are pros and cons of each type of test. I think the at-home test, although most people don't love the at-home test because of all the risk of technological difficulties, if your child has really bad test anxiety, they might feel better taking it from the comfort of their home than having to walk into a big scary testing center. So these are all things to consider.
Absolutely. Thank you, Leanne. Matt, what you got?
Yeah, just to add to what Leanne said, thinking about the child, and I think especially thinking whether they're going to take it on paper or via computer, it's part of that choice is how they feel about bubbling. Bubbling on the standardized test sheet is a skill on its own, and a student who's very familiar with it will, in a lot of ways, score better than one who's not familiar with it, especially with the paper. Getting mixed up on that or getting out of your head to worry about the bubble sheet can really just it's just too much of it's just a lot for some students. So that's another reason why the computer may be preferable.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, bubbling, it seems silly to say, but it is a skill. And for a lot of New York City private school students, it's not a skill that is, you know, drilled into their brains the way it was, you know, at the public school that I went to in Texas, or you know, Kara also went to a public school. You know, we were taught that skill quite early, which is neither a good thing nor a bad thing. It's just a thing. So that's worth considering. I will say, though, that though the ISEE has the ability to eliminate answers digitally, I love crossing out answers and really giving the student the pencil and saying, now cross it out, get rid of them. And so there's an old school part of me that just really thinks that that sort of tactile experience of the paper and pencil can be extremely effective given the needs of the student, as Leanne and Matt have brought up.
I also should add that there are accommodations to circle in the booklet. So some students can get that, and that can eliminate that issue.
Very good, very good.
I have to say I'm always a bit torn. In general, I just prefer paper. I like being able to write. I'm old-fashioned. I like reading on paper. But the bubbling alone almost tips it in the other direction for me, because I always found it so stressful trying to make my bubbles perfect and wasted a lot of time. And just being able to click something is awfully nice. So it really depends on the student.
It is worth saying that we at Bespoke, and broadly speaking, practice resources for paper mock testing is more widely available. And I'm a big believer in practice the way you play. And so if the student is going to encounter it more easily on paper to practice, then I want it to be on paper on game day. But as we've demonstrated, there are a lot of options here. And the thing that makes the most sense is the thing that works best for your student. Now, finally, points guy, SSAT. Matt, take it away.
All right. So just like with the ISEE, we're not really looking at the raw score. They're taking the raw score, but instead of putting it into stay nines, it's into a more SAT-like 800 per the three categories, the math, the reading, the verbal. So the top score can be 2,400 that way, and most selective schools are looking for 2,100 plus. But it's not the score that I know I'm looking at as a tutor most of the time. It's that percentile, and that's what a lot of the schools care about more too. And again, 80th percentile is really the goal here. So just like with the ISEE, we were talking about how that 7 stay 9 is the 80% range. We're thinking of the same here as like an excellent score.
Yeah, and it is worth saying that that is significantly different than the percentiles you'll be looking for on the SAT and the ACT with high school students. Because for the most selective colleges, they're really looking for 95th to even 99th percentile. But that makes sense because ACT and SAT is the whole nation. The ISEE and the SSAT are a much smaller sample size that is, you know, in many ways largely concentrated around schools like New York City private schools. So an 80th percentile on these tests carries significantly more weight than, you know, an 80th percentile on the ACT or the SAT. So just keep that in mind. Fantastic. All right, well, Leanne, you've already given us so much good information about accommodations so far. Let's journey further into that. What do accommodations look like on the ISEE and the SSAT?
Okay, so accommodations are designed to allow students with disabilities to demonstrate their true aptitude on these tests. And this does not give them any advantage or anything like that. And so there's no flagging on the test score reports. That means that the score report that you receive and send to the schools you're applying to will not show whether or not your child had accommodations on the test. So we definitely recommend that if your child receives accommodations at school, that they also get those accommodations on the test so that they can really show their true colors. In order to apply for accommodations, you can go to the websites that we linked here on the slideshow, and you apply for the accommodations before you register for the test. You have to have your your request approved before you can register. So that's really important. That process usually takes about 2 weeks, but we recommend that you allow 4 weeks to be safe. Because suppose you apply for accommodations, you wait the 2 weeks and they get back to you saying, actually, you need some more documentation. Now you have another 2 weeks to wait before you can register for the test. And the sites that do have accommodations tend to fill up quickly. So you want to make sure that you're registering early, which means applying for accommodations even earlier. So you want to get started on that really as soon as possible. You'll have to upload documentation. There are a lot of examples of different types of documentation that they'll take: an IEP, an ISP, a 504 plan, or testing results. The ISEE specifies that your child has to be using the accommodations you're applying for in school now, and the SSAT doesn't. So I would check in on those websites and with those organizations about whether or not you can ask for an accommodation that you're not regularly getting in the school setting. And we already talked about, consider what type of test you want to sign up for. Is it paper? Is it computer? For example, if your child has a word processor as an accommodation, or if your child gets enlarged print for a visual impairment or another issue, if you take the computerized test, you won't need those accommodations. So that's something to just consider as you're starting this whole process.
Thank you so much, Leanne. And it is so important that that the students who need accommodations be able to get them so that they can be, fairly, can approach this process fairly and be fairly assessed in their admissions process. All right, so that concludes the kind of fundamentals of the ISEE and the SSAT. Now we're going to look at some of the similarities and differences, which is going to get a little bit nittier, grittier into the types of questions and the methods that these tests use. So let's take a look at what's going to be similar on these tests. In the verbal section, you're going to see synonyms in both. We're going to take a look at that in a second. On the reading, you're going to see some fundamentals that are similar to both, with the exclusion of the poem that is on the SSAT. And then most math word problems are going to be somewhat similar on both tests. It's also worth saying that the fundamentals of the math content are very similar on both tests. And this means that if you're not sure which test the student should be taking at first, you can start preparing in a way that is effective to both of them, because you're going to be working on math foundations, working on reading foundations, and even that verbal, starting with the vocab, we're going to talk about this 2 to 3 words a day starting today. Those can all come into play on both tests. Let's break this down a little bit more, question by question. Matt, tell me about synonyms.
Yeah, so these are the way that synonyms look on both the ISEE, that's the one on the left with 4 choices, and then the SSAT, the one on the right, persevere with 5 choices. On both tests, students with standard timing have about 30 seconds it breaks down to each to solve these. And just by looking at these, you don't have a lot of context around these words. This is why we'll say you should especially start studying vocabulary right now, because just having a word bank and a lot of words behind you just really help on this section on both tests.
Absolutely. On the synonyms in particular, the easiest way to get it right is to know the word. We do teach strategies about how to get around it if the student doesn't. For example, maybe with a word like diminish, they'll recognize the word dim or mini, both of which could help them get to reduce. But the simplest way is just to know the word. And we have Quizlets available. We'll go into the resources in a bit. In the back of our book are extensive word lists, vocab boxes, which group words by similar meanings. You're not learning the individual meanings, but rather the general idea. There are a lot of ways to get a lot of words into a student's brain before test day, and that is critical.
Even just having seen a word and knowing if it's positive or negative can help make something like diminish or persevere.
Yeah, I used to teach this as Gryffindor and Slytherin words, because some words sound good or bad, but students increasingly haven't read Harry Potter, and J.K. Rowling is increasingly problematic. So I'll need to find a different way of teaching that. But it's true that some words have a hiss to them that make them sound negative, and some words, I joke that if I told the student, hey, you're blank, and you wanted to go, hey, that's not very nice, without even knowing what the word meant, it's probably negative. And you said, oh, thanks, not knowing what the word meant, it's probably positive. So there's a lot that can be done, but just knowing the word is our best way in. Speaking of knowing and recognizing words, Kara, can you tell me about the reading that they're going to see on both of these tests?
Yes, most of the reading across these tests is pretty similar. There's going to be a short passage like the one you see on the screen, followed by usually 6, maybe 7 questions. And I usually tell students that this reading test, almost any reading test you ever take in your life, is going to be looking for 2 main skills. Can you summarize what you've read and give the main idea? And can you go back and look up details? And some other question types you might see are inference or connecting the dots, vocabulary in context, and the tone or the mood. And one of the most common issues we have with students, these younger students taking the reading test, is learning how to go back. A lot of students like to read the passage and then just try to barrel through all the questions. So we really work with students on how to identify where do I need to go, and really finding the answer in the passage rather than just trying to remember it. Yes?
Kara, keep going.
Yeah, I always like to use the example of the DVD game Seen It, which I used to love, and most students haven't played it now, but in that game, they'd show you a movie clip, and then at the end, you'd have to answer a question, and they were often really random, like what color shirt was the passerby on the bicycle wearing? So the whole movie clip, you're just trying to grab every little detail you can find and memorize them all, and hopefully you can pull it out when you need it. And I always say, this is not Seen It. You can just go back and look at the person on the bicycle and find their shirt. So why wouldn't you do that? Always go back and find the answer.
That skill is so important. We have young students who just want to read it and go straight in, and I have won a major victory if I can get them to turn the page back. As you've noticed, I've been flipping back and forth between the reading and the questions. Take their finger and put it on the sentence where the answer is. If we can do that, 90% chance they're going to get the answer right. If we don't do that, 50% less. Some students do have a really capacious memory early on, but even then, that's still a recipe for throwing points out the window. So even just the skill of going back and putting your finger on the page is a real good one. Great, so those are our content similarities, but now we're going to move into some of our content differences. For the ISEE, we're going to see that they have the sentence completions, or fill in the blanks on the verbal, and those quantitative comparisons, which Kara was alluding to at the very beginning, the column questions. Those are going to be unique specifically to the middle level and upper level of the ISEE. P.S. They also show up on the GRE, which is funny because it's like middle schoolers and college graduates. I don't know, but in any case, there they are. On the SSAT, we're going to get those analogies, which are super fun and peculiar. And then we're going to get a poem, as well as a more sort of puzzle-based approach to math questions. Let's dig in. So first, Matt, can you give me the deal on sentence completions on the ISEE?
Yeah, so the sentence completion problems complement the synonyms on the ISEE verbal section. And as you can see here, this is much less about just quick recall of knowing the word. You have a lot of context to work with, and we have a lot of strategies of how to use that context to get to the right answer. I find these definitely quite pleasurable to tutor because they're so teachable, and students really start to click, even younger students, about finding the clues in the sentence, like here, leading. You can connect that with renown to get the right answer, that those words are connected. And that's just one example of how this can work.
Absolutely. I will always draw a magnifying glass on the student's page. That is a pretty good zoom magnifying
Yeah,
glass.
that's really good.
Because I want them to be sleuths. I want them to look for clues in the passage or in the sentence, whether that's words that will indicate what the meaning of the blank is, or even words that will indicate the relationship of the meaning of the word in the blank. However, versus because. One is going to flip the meaning, one is going to equal sign to the meaning. And once the student has learned to look for them, it makes these a lot more guessable. So unlike the synonyms, which can only be taught to a certain degree, the sentence completions absolutely can be taught if the students learn to be sleuths about it. I guess I should erase my drawing. Okay, fantastic. Let's move along to the SSAT reading, which is going to feature a poem. Nope. Wait, okay, nope, I'm out of order again. Let's go to the SSAT, excuse me, the ISEE math, which is going to include these column questions that also appear on the GRE. Leanne, take it away.
All right. This is the perhaps less popular part of the math section. These are quantitative comparisons. These are unique to the ISEE, and they are not on the lower level tests. They're only on middle and upper level. And these are sort of a different beast than the other types of math questions because they require a type of critical thinking about math that I really haven't seen taught in schools. So there are two quantities given, and the student needs to determine, is the quantity in column A greater? Is the quantity in column B greater? Are they equal, or does it depend? And the trick here is to teach kids not to fall for any traps and not to make any quick assumptions. So although x squared might seem at first to be smaller than x cubed, because if x represented a number, just a regular old counting number like 2, 3, 4, or 5, that would be the case. But what we teach kids on this section, if they're going to use a strategy we call plug-in numbers, where they try different numbers, we teach them to try to look for a number that will create an exception. Can we show, now that we know that column A can be smaller, column B can be greater, can we show the opposite, or can we show something different? So we try numbers like 0 or 1 that have special properties. And if you plug in 0 or 1, the answer is actually C. You could also try a negative number or a fraction and see how that changes the answer. If we tried -1, then actually we find out that column A is bigger. So this does involve knowledge of math concepts, but it also involves a type of critical thinking that some students, even if they know how to square -1 and cube -1, they still might not think to try that number. So a lot of this is about exposure and just practicing these kinds of questions.
Absolutely, Leanne. You know, from the jump, when I teach this lesson, and by the way, our books have an extensive lesson on quantitative comparisons, which gives 6 terrific strategies which reduce the amount of math a student needs to do and really give them ways of approaching. From the beginning of that chapter, I want them looking for D. I want them to say, to interrupt that initial impulse that says, oh, obviously cubed is bigger than squared, duh, and say, okay, hold, let me look for D. Because if I can prove 2 answers correct, the way that we've proven A could be correct, C could be correct, and B could be correct here, 2 or more answers that is, then the answer must be D, and you have proven it. So like Leanne was saying, it's interrupting that sort of impulse and going into that strategic thought. I found that when students when they click with that approach, they tend to really like this section because it's fun, it's strategic, and you sort of feel like you're strategizing your way through. But there are a lot of pitfalls. There are a lot of gotchas, as it were. So that is worth thinking about. Kara, you got your hand raised.
I think this is a section that's especially important to have a lot of exposure to. Just like you said, with those pitfalls and those gotchas, they might get you that first time, and then you know, oh, I've seen this one before. I need to try a negative number. Or, oh, this is an area versus perimeter problem. I need to try a really long and skinny rectangle, and then I need to try a square. And a lot of those, if you've seen them over and over and over again, you start to know, oh, it's this kind. Oh, it's that kind.
Yeah.
There's only so many gotchas they use.
Yeah. And you know, I when I teach these, I call those the usual suspects. I want students to know 1, 0, negatives, positives, fractions, evens, odds. And I want them in their bank. This actually works for high school students too, for different things. And I was teaching this to high school students, and someone was like, usual suspects, isn't that a movie with Kevin Spacey? And I was like, well, technically it's a Casablanca reference. Another kid in the class was like, it's a really good movie. So, you know, it all goes back to, I don't know why I'm talking about this. Let's move on to the SSAT poem, this reading section, which will get a little bit more complicated, but as Kara will explain, not too much.
The main reading difference between the ISEE and the SSAT is that the SSAT will always include a poem. And as I said before, just more variety in general, maybe fiction, a how-to, a newspaper article. And in general, the SSAT involves more metaphorical language. And it might even ask, like, which literary device was used in this sentence? Things like that. The poetry can look really scary. It's often not as bad as it seems when you actually look at the questions. But I think in general for the SSAT, what I have noticed is that when my students are not just strong readers, but students that enjoy reading and that read outside of school for pleasure tend to like the SSAT. And students that don't love reading and treat it more as a chore tend to not like the SSAT. So that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, if you like reading, the SSAT is a good one. But now, how can a student answer a metaphor question on a multiple choice test? That seems crazy. That seems like not what it's for. What do we do, Kara?
Well, just like we talked about before, go back to the passage and be sleuthy. And the metaphor is usually going to be some sort of main idea that was clearly presented.
Right. So they're not going to ask you to really, you know, multiple choice interpret a highly ambiguous image. It's going to be something that summarizes the main idea of the poem as if it were the question, what is the main idea of the poem? So it is not as tricky as it may seem. All righty, let's get to everyone's favorite subject to discuss on the SSAT, the analogies. Matt, take it away.
Yeah, so these analogies on the SSAT complement the synonyms. So you can think of it as replacing the sentence completion from the ISEE here. But and this here, these are often require a little more like real world experience. Even knowing what sautéing is here might be something that students are not familiar with. Baby animals come up on these, spices, kinds of trees sometimes. But, you know, it's about connecting the first two words and finding a way that is similar to the last two words. And for students who really like to read or like to use high-level critical thinking skills, I really feel like this is the section like quantitative comparison that engages students in critical thinking. This is an excellent skill, and it can be a lot of fun once you get into it. I know Kara also really likes these. So yeah, it's something that students can initially be a little afraid of, and it might keep them from wanting to take the SSAT, but it's also a really excellent part of the test.
Yeah, there are absolutely challenges and opportunities with the analogies. One of the challenges is that when we're talking about building that connection, it's easy to build too broad of a bridge. For example, a student might look at this one and say, onions are to sautéing. Oh, well, obviously you saute onions, and then they're done. Except they're not done, because you dice peppers, roast nuts, mashed potatoes, sliced tomatoes, and minced garlic. So that bridge effectively didn't remove anything. This is why, and here we get to an opportunity, you can make these very teachable by using the phrase by definition. by making this as specific of a bridge as possible. By definition, sautéing onions is to cook them. Or as I was teaching, I was doing the ISEE and SSAT training, and a tutor who had a chemistry background was, well, by definition, it's facilitating a chemical change. And I was like, that is true. So we now look at our answers and we see that only roasting facilitates a chemical change. The others are all physical or cosmetic changes. Only roasting is cooking. And that would be the more specific bridge that actually gets us there. Our book, once again, has a really terrific breakdown of all the kinds of strategies you can apply, the common types of analogies, whether it's opposites or synonyms or type of blank. We have, shoe is to loafer. But, that question actually also points to one of the challenges, which is that it's a little peculiar where these words are going to come from. Sauté, loafer, these aren't going to show up on a vocab list because they're sort of world exposure words. I don't know if I would have known what a loafer was in middle school. I could tell you, I could recite lines of Shakespeare, but Shakespeare doesn't talk about loafers. So it's a little bit luck of a draw. I do remember there was an analogy that used the word quarry to know where rocks come from, and I had played a video game where you had to harvest the rocks from the quarry. So I got that one for that reason. It's a little bit of a dice roll, but they're fun if the student does end up choosing the SSAT. Speaking of more on the SSAT, let's break down the sort of puzzle-like quality, the process-based quality of the SSAT math questions. Leanne, take it away.
All right, well, all those cooking and slicing terms have made me hungry now, but I will do my best. So the math section on the SSAT is a little bit reading heavy. There are a lot of word problems on this section. There are also calculations and some more basic questions, but it's word problem heavy. So one thing that we do is we teach students to really understand the problem. A lot of kids are really quick to try and just see some numbers and start doing calculations. So we really teach them to understand the problem and not just jump into doing any computation. In fact, the general rule is do as little computation as possible because of time constraints on the test. So for example, this problem talks about a third of the weight of a truck is 2.4 tons. So we would just draw a rectangle to represent a truck. And then they ask about the weight of 3 trucks. So we draw 2 more rectangles. And then we would cut these rectangles into thirds. Put 2.4 in 1/3 of one truck. And then just see how many times we see 2.4. And that's your answer. So we can figure out the answer to this problem without doing multiplication and then division. So, and there are very specific strategies that we teach for the math section. Before we even would have gone about solving this problem, I would have had children eliminate any answer choices that don't make sense before we even try to solve it. Sometimes just eliminating gets you the right answer. So as little work as possible, really. The next example here is a kind of content I would call other on this test. The ISEE doesn't really have as much of this as the SSAT. You'll see problems that ask you to rotate an object, how many cubes are in this figure, and the children have to take into account the cubes they can't see that are behind or under another cube. They might ask, which of these figures can be traced without lifting your pencil? Things that aren't really taught in school. And so they do require, again, just like the quantitative comparisons on the ISEE, these require exposure and familiarity and practice.
Yes.
So this interesting problem here is multiplication algorithm using letters instead of numbers, which I think is kind of fun. And really part of the demystifying process, really, I think when kids look at this, their initial thought is, oh no, but it's really not that complicated. I mean, we teach them to take it one step at a time to eliminate. If we know how to multiply numbers, then we can just look at where we would start, which is in the ones place on each number, F times A. And if F times A is F, then A had to be 1 and you're done. So these aren't as complicated or scary as they look at first, and just practice will help kids get used to it and melt away some of that anxiety that can prevent them from tackling problems that they're capable of answering.
Absolutely. And really that practice and exposure, specifically by our homeworks and our mock tests, which we will get to quickly in a moment. I know we are at time now. That's how a student is going to build that confidence that the first time they see it, they don't know how to do it. The fifth time they see it, it's an old friend. So I'm going to quickly address these essays. So the essays on the ISEE and the SSAT are very similar. ISEE is 30 minutes, SSAT is 25 minutes. They are going to be an opportunity for the student to demonstrate a writing sample. This is important because schools have become a little bit skeptical about the essays that are turned in with their admissions essay or with their admissions packets. They just assume that they've been coached and they're not an authentic sample of the student's voice. Therefore, these essays show an unvarnished, glimpse into the student's writing style. So task number 1, write a well-organized 4 to 5 paragraph essay. But there's a second task here, which is to show a little bit about yourself, because these essays will be personal and or persuasive. What's your favorite book? What's your favorite class? Who's someone that you look up to? So on and so forth. What I like to do with both these types of essays is make sure the student has 5 things that they know they can write about. Because usually with those 5 things that I've literally already had them write essays for, they can come in and then pivot whatever question that they get to one of those 5 things. So it's not graded, but it is potentially, very important to the admissions process. All right, so we're going to blaze through the final slides here. Here we've got some of the challenges of the ISEE versus the challenges of the SSAT. I think we've covered these in detail. So I'm going to keep us moving forward to our question. Broadly speaking, how do we decide? How do we decide? Open conversation.
Well, I know, first of all, you should really check with the schools you're applying for. Sometimes you can't decide, but often just take a practice test in each, if you're unsure at the beginning and you do have a choice, and the scores will tell you a little bit, but also a student, if they have a preference, something they really like or really don't like, I go with that because the student's the one who has to make the buy-in and do all this consistent work week after week, month after month before the test.
Absolutely. And then as we discussed, if you're a stronger reader, the SSAT might be the thing, but student buy-in really is it. Very briefly, a little bit about preparation timeline. When should you start? Now, especially on vocab. Get those words in. It's a lot easier to learn them 2 to 3 now than 10 words a day in the fall. How many times per week should you meet? Once, twice. It depends on the schedule. It depends on the skill level of the student. It depends on the age and the patience. That's something that you can work out with a tutor. Mock testing. It's a great idea to start now. Get a score in so you know where you're starting. And then in the fall, about once a month is a good way of not only practicing and assessing where you are, but really facilitating that exposure to these tests. If you're working with a tutor, the tutor can help you organize homework. So just like a musical instrument or just like an athletic skill, the student is practicing every day. And with that athletic metaphor in mind, think of yourself as a team, as team family with the student taking these tests. And you can use a tutor like Leanne, like Matt, like Kara, like myself, like any of the other tutors at Bespoke to help organize your time, to help you show where you're going and see where you are. So Dan, I'm gonna hand it back to you to talk about how Bespoke can help. I just wanna say thank you to the panelists for joining us and for the expertise you've brought today.
And I'll second that. Thank you, Kara, Leanne, Matt, and Gary. Thank you so much. This is really terrific. A huge amount of helpful, useful information, and thank you for delivering it to us all so clearly. Yes, Bespoke can help. As I said before, we are available to answer the phone in business hours or to schedule a phone call at your convenience to really talk you through what this process might look like for you and your family. We've been having these conversations for years. As I said, almost 20 years. Any of the tutors you've seen today are free and able to tutor your child. We also have many other tutors, or if you just want somebody to hold your hand as you make some decisions and lay out a roadmap for yourself to work on this independently, we are here for that as well. I believe we've got our contact info in the chat, or it will be posted there in just a moment. So please give us a call. We are so glad to talk and to just try to sort this out. I know it can be so confusing, but hopefully some of the clarity, some of the organization that you've seen today, we are definitely available to bring that to your life and to your process of preparing for these tests. So with no more, thank you guys. Thank you for being here. Please spread the word. We're always looking for audience for these, and we really think we've got some useful, simple stuff to share. So if you enjoyed this, we're going to be sending out the video. You can send that link around, or just tell people to contact us and reach out for the video themselves, because we're glad to share it. Thank you all. Thank you again, panelists. Thank you, audience. Have a wonderful day.